Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into just a few weeks, really, in September 1938, a moment when Europe felt like it was holding its breath.
Mm-hmm.
The focus is Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, and his truly unprecedented journey to meet Adolf Hitler, carrying, this desperate hope that war could still be avoided.
Yeah, we've been looking through the sources you mentioned, accounts detailing that really tense lead up to the Munich Agreement, the meetings themselves, the immediate fallout, and, well, the incredibly complex legacy. It's still so controversial.
Right. So our mission here in this deep dive is to use these sources as our guide. We want to pull out the key events, understand the intense pressures, the motivations flying around, and really grapple with why this moment is still so debated.
It's got all the drama, hasn't it? Europe just teetering on the edge.
Exactly. And the sheer shock of a British prime minister flying to meet Hitler face to face, you have to remember, that was a huge deal back then.
Oh, absolutely. And everything riding on this slim chance for peace.
So, to really set the scene, you have to think back to the shadow of the First World War. That conflict, it left this deep scar across Europe. The universal feeling was never again.
Definitely. But by the late 30s, Hitler's Germany had been, systematically tearing up the Treaty of Versailles. The sources mentioned the Rhineland reoccupation, the Anschluss with Austria.
And then his focus shifts, laser-like, onto the Sudetenland.
Right, that region in Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population.
And the sources highlight this wasn't just about ethnic Germans, was it? Strategically, the Sudetenland was vital. It was Czechoslovakia's fortified border. Losing it
would leave the whole country vulnerable, exposed.
Yeah. And for Chamberlain, he'd lived through the absolute horror of World War I. The thought of another war like that was just unthinkable for him.
So his driving force, according to these accounts, was this really profound determination to use diplomacy, to find any way, any path to avoid repeating that slaughter. This approach, giving concessions to avoid war.
That's what became known as appeasement, which brings us to that first, extraordinary step. The meeting at the Berghof, September 15th, 1938.
It really was extraordinary. Several sources point out just how new this was. Chamberlain was 69, never flown before apparently.
Imagine.
And he gets on a plane specifically to go meet Hitler in Germany.
Just picture it. He lands in Munich, then travels up to Hitler's mountain place, the Berghof. The accounts really paint a picture, don't they? This sort of English gentleman.
Yeah, with the hat and umbrella, apparently.
Right. Facing off against this fiery German dictator. The dynamic sounds just electric.
And Hitler, well, he wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat, was he? The sources say he just launched into this tirade, raging about how Germans were supposedly being treated in Czechoslovakia.
And demanding the Sudetenland, not eventually, but now.
Pretty much immediately, yeah. And Chamberlain focused on avoiding war at almost any cost. He actually agreed. In principle, anyway.
Agreed to the transfer?
In principle, yes.
Yeah.
Provided the handover was peaceful. That was his condition.
Okay. So he flies back to London.
And the sources say he worked like crazy to get the French government to back this plan.
And together, Britain and France, they leaned hard on the Czechoslovak president, Benija.
Immense pressure. The Czechs were, understandably, very reluctant, giving up their main defense line.
But they felt they had no choice.
Under that pressure, they caved. They agreed.
And here's a crucial point from the sources, isn't it? Chamberlain, at this moment, genuinely thought he'd done it.
He really did. He thought, okay, crisis averted. Agreement in principle. French on board. Czechs have accepted. Problem solved.
But it was a huge miscalculation.
A fundamental one, as the accounts really stress.
Heartbreaking, really, because just a week later, September 22nd, he flies back. This time to Bad Godesberg. Expecting what? To just sort out the details.
Exactly. He thought he was going to finalize the peaceful transfer. Dot the I's, cross the T's, that sort of thing.
Nope.
Not at all. The sources describe a complete shift. Hitler's mood, his whole approach.
Yeah.
Totally different. No more diplomacy. Just demands.
And much tougher demands now.
Oh, yeah. Escalated significantly. He wasn't talking about a peaceful transfer anymore.
What did he want then?
Immediate military occupation of the Sudetenland. Right away. No international oversight, no gradual process, just German troops marching in.
Wow. Just marching in.
And he attached an ultimatum. A brutal one. Accept these terms by September 28th, just days away, or it's war.
And this is where Chamberlain starts to realize.
It seems so. According to the accounts, this is the point where the awful realization dawns. This isn't just about ethnic Germans anymore. This is empire building. Outright expansion by force.
And back in Britain, when this news gets out, what was the feeling?
Pure fear. according to the sources. They paint this really vivid picture. Gas masks being handed out, people digging air raid shelters in their gardens, newspapers basically screaming about war being imminent.
So Chamberlain comes back from Bad Godesberg, shaken.
Visibly shaken, yes.
Huh?
And he publicly calls Hitler's new terms unreasonable, a really stark change from the optimism after the first meeting.
Okay, so war looks almost certain. The deadline is ticking down, which leads us to the Munich conference, September 29th.
Right. The context is just
Yeah.
absolute crisis, imminent war. The sources mentioned it was actually Mussolini who suggested it, this last-ditch conference in Munich.
And Chamberlain grabbed the chance.
Jumped at it, yeah. Anything to avoid war.
So the meeting itself. 4 men deciding the fate of another country. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and the French premier, Daladier.
And the most damning detail, highlighted again and again in the sources, Czechoslovakia wasn't invited.
Their country's being carved up and they're not even in the room.
Exactly. Not allowed in the room where it happens.
So under this immense pressure, with Hitler's deadline hanging over them, they gave in.
They capitulated. Germany gets the Sudetenland.
And what did Hitler give in return?
A promise. The sources report he gave this solemn guarantee. This is my last territorial demand in Europe. That's it. No more.
And Chamberlain, he believed him. He took him at his word.
He wanted peace so desperately. He seemed to take Hitler at his word, yes.
So he flies back to Britain the next day, September 30th.
And the sources describe that famous scene, stepping off the plane, waving the piece of paper, the agreement signed by him and Hitler.
Addressing the cheering crowd.
And declaring, I believe it is peace for our time.
Oh, the tragic irony. Because that peace, it lasted barely 6 months.
Barely. March 1939. Hitler just tore up the agreement, completely disregarded the promise.
German troops marched into Prague.
And the rest of Czechoslovakia was just swallowed, absorbed into the Reich.
No more pretense about protecting minorities now.
No. The sources are clear. This is just naked conquest. Brutal, straightforward aggression.
And the world reaction, just disbelief.
Disbelief, shock, and Chamberlain. The account suggests he was heartbroken, utterly betrayed. He finally saw that appeasement, his whole strategy, had failed. Completely.
And that failure led to a major policy shift, didn't it?
A fundamental one. Britain and France finally drew a line. They pledged to defend Poland if Hitler invaded next.
The line in the sand.
And when Hitler crossed that line, invading Poland, just months later, September 1939.
That was it. The Second World War began.
Which brings us straight into this really complex, fiercely debated legacy. The question that echoes through the sources is pretty stark. Was Chamberlain naive? Was he a fool?
You certainly hear that view. Churchill's famous line is often quoted, isn't it? You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. It's brutal.
It is. But then you have to look at the wider context the sources provide. History is rarely that simple, is it?
No.
Several accounts make a strong case that Britain in 1938 simply wasn't ready for war. The military was weak, yes, but maybe more importantly, the people, the public mood. Still so traumatized by WWI, they weren't ready for another conflict.
So that brings up the counter-argument. Did Munich actually buy time?
Yeah.
Valuable time?
That's a key point. Some historians argue, yes, that the year gain between Munich, September 38, and the start of the war in September 39 was crucial. Time Britain used to rearm, to prepare.
The sources specifically mention the RAF, the Royal Air Force.
Right, noting it was significantly stronger by 1940 for the Battle of Britain, arguably because of that extra year.
Still, even if it bought time, there was a massive moral cost, wasn't there?
Immense. The sources really stress this. Giving in to Hitler like that, it arguably just encouraged him, made him think the democracies were weak, divided, easily pushed around.
And the country that paid the highest price.
Unquestionably, Czechoslovakia. Sacrificed, as the accounts put it, in that desperate bid for peace.
Looking back at Chamberlain himself, the sources paint a pretty complex, maybe even tragic picture. He died in November 1940, didn't he?
Yeah, just over a year into the war, he tried so hard to stop. He never saw the eventual Allied victory or the full horrifying extent of what Hitler would do.
And his name just became synonymous with appeasement, like a shorthand for failed policy.
Pretty much, yeah. Fairly or unfairly. But the sources we look at tend to portray him less as a villain and more as, well, a man caught in an almost impossible situation.
Trapped between the trauma of the last war and the terrifying approach of the next one.
Exactly. Squeezed. One thought that really comes through from the material is maybe the tragedy wasn't trying to make peace. I mean, who wouldn't want to avoid war?
Of course.
Maybe the real tragedy was trying to make peace with someone like Adolf Hitler, a man whose goals were just fundamentally opposed to genuine peace, who saw agreements as just, temporary tools.
Reflecting on all this, the weight of those meetings, the catastrophic results, you really feel the crushing pressure leaders face in these kinds of crises.
Oh, absolutely. It makes you think about the truly impossible choices they sometimes have, where every option looks bad, maybe just in different ways. And the right path, well, that often only seems clear much, much later with hindsight.
So based on this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about is this. What does Chamberlain's desperate attempt at peace in 1938 tell us about those impossible choices leaders sometimes face? And how does the context of their specific time, the memories, the fears, the limitations, shape how we end up judging them years or even decades down the line? It's a question that feels like it stretches way beyond just the autumn of 1938.